main constitutional purpose of having congressmen elected by the people and senators chosen by the state legislatures, according to the Founding Fathers' writings and the Federalist Papers, was to insulate senators from the influences of factionalism, to secure them from the temptations of campaign financing, and to allow them the time and quiet contemplation necessary to determine whether a bill before them was in the best interests of the nation and their state. A secondary purpose in having the state legislatures choose U.S. senators was to give the states standing in federal courts against the federal government, and to give the state legislatures the authority to recall their U.S. senators for conduct not in the best interests of the states. These purposes were and are so important that Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution prohibits any amendment from depriving any state of its suffrage in the Senate without its consent. I quote Article 5 in pertinent part, quote, provided that no state without its consent shall be deprived of its equal suffrage in the Senate, end quote. When the 17th Amendment was declared ratified by corrupt, progressive Democrat Secretary of State William Jennings Bryan, 10 states had not given consent to being deprived of their suffrage in the Senate. Utah and Delaware withheld their consent to being deprived of their suffrage in the Senate by voting to reject the proposed 17th Amendment. 8 other states withheld their consent by taking no action at all on the proposed 17th Amendment. Do I have to point out that since the 17th Amendment was declared ratified when it was not, and it is therefore null and void from the moment of its inception, do I have to point out that not one single federal law has been passed since the first imposter was elected to the office of U.S. Senator? That not one single cabinet-level appointment has been ratified by a constitutional Senate? That not one treaty has been ratified by a constitutional Senate? That not one Supreme Court justice has been ratified by a constitutional Senate? That not one president has been lawfully sworn in by a constitutionally ratified Supreme Court justice? That not one declaration of war has been lawfully passed by Congress? Can you say rogue occupation government? Can you say in spades? Given everything else this federal government has been doing in the last 100 years, not authorized by the U.S. Constitution, can you say the phrase criminal regime? Can you add the phrase criminal regime to the phrase rogue occupation government? Moving along here. Article 1, Section 10, Clause 1, quote, no state shall make anything but gold and silver coin a tender in payment of debts, end quote. Tender in payment of debts is a legal term. If you perform a contract and someone tries to pay you in kumquats, you are not required to accept payment in kumquats. You may sue your debtor for payment in legal tender, and the state courts are required to rule that you must be paid in legal tender. Worthless paper fiat IOUs called Federal Reserve notes are not legal tender either. The Constitution requires gold and silver coin to be legal tender. Any law saying otherwise is but mere color of law, null and void for lack of any subject matter authority. By the way, there is a federal law that says that these worthless Federal Reserve notes are legal tender, but that law is clearly null and void. By removing the lawful power of states to choose their senators, the states were deprived of their enforceable legal standing in federal courts. As a result, the states have no standing to file suit in federal court requiring the federal government to coin money as required by the U.S. Constitution, and the federal government was free to pass illegal color of law with impunity, making these worthless fiat IOU notes legal tender. And the federal government takes a percentage of these notes out of circulation every time they change hands, so no one notices the horrendous inflation they cause, and then doles them out to the various states as bribes to do federal bidding and to pay for budget items the federal government has deprived the states of their ability to pay for themselves. This also facilitates socialism. Rob everyone blind with taxes our Constitution specifically prohibits, and redistribute the wealth to everyone out there who can't or won't provide for themselves, and in the process make it difficult for those who are trying to provide for themselves to justify the effort they're putting into it. It leaves people asking, why should I work for a living when I can be a social leech and get paid for doing nothing but making babies? When the gross national product falls through the floor because no one sees any reason to work for a living, then socialism morphs into communism, and government has a financial justification to round people up, put them in concentration camps, shoot the intellectuals, the religious, and anyone else who seems uncooperative, and order everyone else to work at whatever job some government thug thinks needs doing or that benefits him personally. Commissars get rich, everyone else gets hard labor, and anyone who objects gets a firing squad as a warning to others. Well, maybe a few hours or days on the torture rack first just for the fun of it, or on the operating table for medical research, or maybe the concentration camp commander uses the inmates for target practice from his balcony over the exercise yard, just to hone his skills, you understand, like some of them did during the Holocaust in Hitler's Germany. Now you have Marxism most foul. Nice people, these liberal socialists, aren't they? But there's one pesky little thing still standing in their way. People don't take kindly to being led off to the concentration camp when they're armed. So the Marxist mafia first has to deal with that problem. 1863, Democrat Senator Thomas J. Dodd introduces Senate Bill 1975, a bill to regulate the interstate shipment of firearms. Thankfully, it died in committee. 1965, Democrat Senator Thomas J. Dodd introduces Senate Bill 1592, a bill to amend the Federal Firearms Act of 1938. Died in committee. 1968, Democrat Senator Thomas J. Dodd introduces what became the Gun Control Act of 1968, which Jews for the Preservation of Firearms Ownership has shown is lifted almost verbatim from Hitler's Nazi weapons law of 1938. Hitler's Nazi weapon law of 1938 was used to disarm Jews, Gypsies, and anyone else the Nazis could scapegoat, and facilitated the Holocaust. 6 million Jews murdered, another 5 million non-Jews murdered. The Gun Control Act of 1968, just like the National Firearms Act of 1934, was and is entirely without lawful federal authority, and was and is today flatly unconstitutional. It has no subject matter authority to be enforced. It's enforced by the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms and Explosives, who license gun dealers, and the federal government doesn't even have the authority to license gun dealers. The Marxist mafia doesn't care if it can disarm the American people and further their plan to turn America into a clone of the Soviet Union. They are here now, and they are working tirelessly to do exactly that. But the American people do care. The number of firearms in private hands increases by leaps and bounds every time these Marxist proxies try to ram gun control down our throats, because we can see the writing on the wall. 1993, the totally illegal color of law called the Brady Handgun Violence Prevention Act of 1993 was passed by a Marxist mafia Congress and signed into color of law by Wet Willie Clinton. This null and void violation of the U.S. Constitution compels a written interrogation under threat of criminal sanction as a precondition to receiving, or being denied, permission to exercise our inherited and unalienable right to keep and bear arms. Do you know of any other right that requires an interrogation, for crying out loud, before being allowed to exercise a right? Then it requires a search of otherwise private information on government databases based on the aforementioned interrogation to confirm that information, all in direct, flagrant, egregious violation of our Fourth Amendment guaranteed right to be secure from unwarranted search and seizure in the absence of probable cause of wrongdoing. The purchase of a firearm from a firearm dealer is not probable cause of criminal conduct. It gets worse. Whether permission to exercise one's inherited and unalienable right to keep and bear arms is granted or denied in the above process, the process itself constitutes a deprivation of rights without due process of law. Illegally compelling an interrogation and search as a precondition to being allowed or prohibited the exercise of a right is not due process. The very act of issuing or denying permission to exercise a constitutionally guaranteed right in the absence of delegated authority is a direct, flagrant, and egregious violation of our 10th Amendment right to be secure from the exercise of undelegated authority. The entire process is a violation of the fundamental doctrine that a citizen cannot lawfully be compelled to waive any right as a precondition to being allowed to exercise a right. Government has no authority to allow or deny the exercise of a right that does not infringe upon anyone else's right. That's what unalienable means. Background checks have never prevented a crime, and its backers never intended it to. Its purpose was to render moot and irrelevant our 4th, 5th, and 10th Amendment rights so future governments could decree they didn't apply to other rights either, such as our right to freedom of expression, freedom of religion, freedom to petition government for redress of grievances, etc. Don't you think Marxists would just love to have you apply for permission to write a book or a letter to the editor to ensure your political ideology is pure? This background check tyranny will be revisited in a moment. The subversive insurrectionists are now doubling down.